Thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll get some other folks who are going to trickle in as well. The Harvard Alumni for Mental Health is very excited to welcome Bahia, Karen, and Susanna for our talk today. I'm just going to quickly give a brief introduction and then turn it over for the main event here. Bahia El-Odi took a few stints in investment banking, consulting, tech, and an MBA from HBS to discover the imperative of mental wellness at work and to shift her career to well-being and education. She co-founded True Africa University out of MIT and Kokosha to support minorities and women with educational programs. She also co-founded HSIO with Karen and is currently leading the creation of the School of Muses, a well-being center focused on local arts and crafts. Karen Knopp founds and leads the business case writing team at HBS. She's been championing well-being at work, and along with Bahia, as I just mentioned, co-founded HSIO, which stands for Human Sustainability Inside Out, a provider of mental health support materials and educational programs. Karen's also a speaker on mental health and published author in US, French, and Spanish language press. The co-author of Compassionate Management of Mental Health in the Modern Workplace with Professor John Quelch, Dean of Miami Herbert Business School. And last, but certainly not least, Susanna Harkonnen is a registered mental health professional with global business experience. Susanna is a certified clinical trauma professional, advanced clinical grief counselor, autism spectrum disorder clinical specialist, and trained in workplace mental health first aid and neuroscience. Susanna worked for the United Nations International Labor Organization and the IFC before founding Inner Work. She helps organizations develop solid mental health structures and has a private clinic practice in Geneva, Switzerland to keep relevant. Susanna has trained thousands of professionals globally, ranging from factory workers to ministers. I'm certainly in awe of these phenomenal women, and I will turn it over to all of you to share your thoughts on change and transformation.
Thank you so much, Anne, from the kind presentation, and thank you for all of you to be there at 2 a.m., 10 p.m., and whatever time it may be. So I would like to just ask this question for you is, have you ever heard of the Japanese sea slug? Yeah, Ken is wondering, what is that? It's from my country, but I have never heard. Okay, so then, Anne, if you want just to share with us a video, so Anne is going to share with you in the chat a link, and if you can take a couple of minutes to understand who is our dear slug. So, as you have seen in the video, actually the slug decapitates itself and separates its head from its body, which is actually infested by parasite, right? And which is surprising is that it's not only able to live, but also to fully regenerate himself and regenerate its own organs and keep living, right? So I would like to take this example of the slug to reflect how some of us, COVID and the last couple of years has also been a kind of slug moment for us, right? Our lives have morphed in small or big ways. Things that we all had something close to us, may it be a relationship, a job, a routine, a closed one that has been cut away, right? And we found ourselves with these body cuts, which is infested perhaps with anxiety, stress, uncertainty, and just think about what the hell is going on? My head has been cut off in some ways, right? And perhaps it has been a traumatic event for us, for some of us. And perhaps COVID has not been the traumatic event, like we all didn't perhaps lose, hopefully, somebody close, neither have gone through COVID, but perhaps it has been this event that actually brought to the surface many things that were going on, right? And it's kind of the straw that broke the camel back. And it has been more traumatic in this sense, right? And I would like also to think about how being cut from our body and having our head going on alone in this moment, how we can take this moment also to think about ourselves. How do we want to transform ourselves going through this metamorphosis, and not think about the next version of ourselves, right? Because personally, when I think that when we talk about the best version, we all often refer to a reference, a frame of reference, which is pre-COVID, some structures, some metrics, and now everything changed, right? So instead of thinking about what's the best version of ourselves, what is the next version of ourselves through this self-healing, right, process. And I would like just for you to take a couple of minutes to think about the following question. So my first question will be for you, has in some ways COVID been a traumatic experience in the way that it has been, as I explained, a pure trauma, brought so many things that it was just a massive explosion? And second, in which way has the experience transformed you? And I would like just to take a moment, think about it, perhaps writing down in a paper, and then we will regroup from that. So thank you all for, first of all, taking the moment to reflect and share. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Mohammed, Gozi. For me, for example, if I share, like, just to open up, it really has been first, yes, the loss of a loved one, a familiar in this case, but also the fact that so far all life was structured 10 years view, right? It was clear that you graduate and then you work 3 years and then you do your MBA, after you get your job and whatsoever, and then you plan, and then you're just like, okay, what's going on? So, for example, when we speak about the philosophy of Vladimir Klitschko, and we wanted to bring more of his view, he's now in Kiev, and just like, okay, so that's the kind of things that can happen today, where it seems like we have a health pandemic, a war pandemic, a polarization pandemic. So that's, for example, from my side, and now I would like anybody who wants to share in this room and share life, and then bring it to Susanna that can deep dive more with you into this kind of experience.
Does anybody have any questions or comments at this point before we dive into trauma? Okay, some of you were not here during the presentation, but please feel free to share, since we're a small group. I'm a certified clinical trauma professional, and one of the reasons I am so passionate about trauma is because it changed my life and it changed my practice fundamentally. So I will talk a little bit about trauma, and if there are really knowledgeable people about trauma, please jump in. But I am pretty aware of the fact that trauma talk is common, relatively common in the US, but it's not that common around the world. So, let's make sure that we are all on the same page. And when it comes to trauma, of course, there's the whole business of clinical trauma and DSM-5 and the psychiatric definition of trauma, war veterans and things like that. But ultimately, trauma, to me, the way I see trauma is really, the best definition is that I have been able to find is from Dr. Gabor Mate, who's written really good books about trauma. If you're not familiar with him, I really highly recommend them. And what he's saying is that trauma is not an event or something specific that happens to us. It is what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. So the event that might be traumatizing for you may not be for the next person. And this is exactly what has happened with COVID. Some people have been full-on traumatized and really deeply, it will take years to recover. And some of us have been thriving. I personally found COVID to be really a very creative period, but that doesn't take away the fact that, for some people it wasn't. I lived in Switzerland where we didn't have much restrictions and things, we have nature and all the good stuff. So it was easier to cope, but I have friends who didn't cope that well. So again, when it comes to trauma, I want to just set the stage and go a little bit into. I'm not assuming that you know so much about traumas, but so please ask me if I'm being too high level or if I'm not detailed enough for you. But to make it really simple when it comes to trauma, all mental health issues, all challenges are really come from our brain's threat system, ultimately. And it's really simple. We as human beings, as biological beings, are wired for two things. We are wired for connection and we are wired for danger. And we go between these two extremes all the time. So even in this situation that we're in now, somebody mentioned Zoom fatigue. Well, Zoom can be a very threatening place. It can actually trigger our threat system considerably. Or during COVID, we haven't been able to connect as much as we did in the past, or it has only been through screens. In my particular case, I see clients, everything happens through Zoom and I'm sick and tired of it. So I look forward to, meeting people again. But this constant threat system, that's what drives trauma. And there are four sources of trauma that we can think of. That's the classic shock trauma. What you would think as you have a catastrophe, you have natural disaster, something terrible happens. Then one thing that people often don't consider as trauma is the accumulated stress. Long-term accumulated stress actually is a very, very traumatizing thing for our nervous system. So again, when I'm talking about trauma, it's not some sort of a psychological thing. It really is a biological thing. It's in our body and it's in our nervous system. And and it's embedded there. And trauma has one interesting part, especially when it starts accumulating. It doesn't have a timestamp on it. So our nervous system doesn't know that something happened in the past. When it's traumatized, it actually keeps on living the same thing. Even though sometimes we can live with trauma for years and we don't even, we cope with it, but it's brewing in the background and then it raises its ugly head at one point. This is what has happened for many people with COVID. So let's get back into that. You'll understand this better when I go through this list. But there's the shock trauma, it's the first one. Then there's the accumulated stress, and most of us have that. Then there is the medical trauma and things that have happened, for example, under anesthesia. We've had a bad accident, things, and we've been drugged. Something may have had medical procedures. That's one example. And then the most common in the West, or in the modern, not only in the West, in places like Japan too, is the early and developmental trauma. Things that happen to us when we are small, when we're younger than 3 often, or younger than 6. And those things we don't remember. They are not in our conscious awareness, so they keep lingering in the background. And they build up, and they accumulate over the years. And this is the foundation for most of our stress. And even when it comes to workplace stress, I work with workplace issues with my clients. Most of it actually is linked to early and developmental trauma. So now what COVID has done is that we've had this accumulated trauma, most of us from childhood, plus accumulated stress, and plus a few life events potentially. Accidents, bad stuff happened. And then COVID hit. And it all blew in our faces if we haven't worked through it. And so I'm a very pragmatic person. I always think like, so what do you do? Now, if you're aware of a trauma, what do you do about it? And there are many ways to go about it. The first thing, of course, like in all issues, is to become aware of it. There are signs of, when you have a clear trauma, it's easier to maybe to understand, but then there are some telltale signs of untreated trauma that we don't usually really think about. And one of them is that, if you are stuck all the time in certain issues, and you don't seem to be able to move on, there's certain resistance in you. Procrastination, even if you know what you're supposed to do, even if you have the tools and the skills to do what you're supposed to do, you just can't seem to be able to move on. That is often a telltale sign of trauma. Then the second one, and quite common in certain circles, is that people who really take care of themselves, they eat healthy, they do all the things that you're supposed to do, they exercise, and they still don't get better. And or they have digestive troubles, no matter how healthy they eat and how much healing they engaged in. Then there is the third one, where people are really anxious and fearful and have even panic attacks, and there's just no apparent reason for that. A lot of the younger people, the younger generation at the moment is going through that. The Gen Zs are experiencing a lot of this. Then there is the classic, being caught in a cycle of toxic relationships and self-sabotage and issues at work, hitting the same kind of people, same kind of situations. And I don't want to, when it comes to trauma, I don't want to put anybody on a guilt trip, because when it comes to trauma, this is not a conscious choice. Sometimes people tell us, get a grip, do something differently. But when you're traumatized, you don't even know. It's just so much stronger than you. It's not on your conscious control. It's not your brain that runs the show. It's actually your body and your threat, your survival biology. And then the fifth type of trauma is the, the chronic physical and physical conditions or health conditions that often have a foundation in trauma. They could be completely physical, but there's often some accumulated trauma in the background. Do you have any comments at this point, or any questions? All right. Yes, please, Mohammed.
Yes, thank you, Susanna. You got my voice, right?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Very good. So very insightful. Really appreciate it. And the thing is, when we're talking about the range of neurological and psychiatric behavioral predicaments, we might be touching on a key word of neuroinflammation. And COVID itself causes neuroinflammation because when it enters the brain through the olfactory bulb and it enters the prefrontal areas in the brain and then just, invades through different networks within the frontoamygdala or frontotemporal part of the brain, like these areas. So these areas are predominantly involved in cognitive emotion regulation. And when we have COVID, one of the things that people might be experiencing at the early stage, or they might be going through as they move down the road, they start to have the symptoms of the long COVID, which might be predominantly mental health related. So I'm, Susanna, I've been so privileged for the opportunity of being a Dale Carnegie's trainer, a global trainer for Dale Carnegie's. And we've been going through some principles. They've got like 30 principles within the book, which is called Stop Worrying and Start Living. And I've been thinking through all those principles, not only from the social or the soft skill training perspective, but also from the neuroscience perspective. And it's like an outside in. When we have the social interaction, when we have all the challenges and hustles and bustles in the era of the COVID, what happens within our ear, between our ears and within our skull? So how the brain is going to make through this. And one of the best suggestions, as you were indicating very beautifully in your insights, is that sometimes we need to just stand and see the current status and just say, well, that's the way it is and it cannot be otherwise. So the acceptance, and that's what we usually practice in the ACT methodology as we're going for the CBT. So acceptance and commitment, and as you all know. And then when we go for this, then we face the situation. We're not going to ignore the problem and then just we rethink it. We say, what's the problem? What has caused the problem? What are the solutions? And what is the best solution? 1, 2, 3, 4. And based on that, sometimes we got to find a way to just counteract that problem. For example, if I could not travel outside because of COVID, many of us have had our suitcases right there, but we didn't get a chance to travel. And we used to travel quite a bit, So sometimes when we do not have the capacity or the possibility to travel outside, we can travel inside. So meditation, mindfulness-based cognitive training, mindfulness, practices and stuff like that. And based on this, that has been so impactful in terms of finding the ways how we're going to go for a mental health from the neuropsychiatry and neuropsychiatric point of view, and also the applied neuroscience point of view, because I'm by profession a humble neuroscientist, and I like to study the brain. And as we move, if I would have any other chance to talk about the impact of COVID on the brain, because all the ways go to Rome. So it all refers to the brain. And when we keep the control of our brain, when we sit at the wheels of the brain, then we know how we're going to move forward. But as Albert Einstein was once saying, the only way that we can stay steady and keep the balance when we're riding a bicycle is to let it move forward. So let's move forward. Whatever the case is, we got to be moving forward. And that's the skill, right? So we need to get the people think about their strength, how impactful and how remarkable they are. They are even more, impactful than they think most of the time. And yeah, that's my time now. I know that I've been over talking, but I will pause here. If I would get another chance, I will certainly get back with some other humble insights regarding 3 publications that we have had on the impact of COVID on brain health and how we can get together within HUM to put them into perspective, to materialize on those insights that have already been published, and how we can go hand in hand to make real change. Thank you for the opportunity, Susanna, and the rest of the panel.
Thank you. We'd love to see the beginning of the papers or some of the research. When you say, we need to find a way forward, it brought back to me the research by Professor Tedeschi, I think is his name, who popularized the term post-traumatic growth. I mean, the concept has certainly been around, but one of the things that actually happens once you do stop a little bit and take time, so not stop and freeze, but stop and take time, and people have gone through trauma, I think, he distinguished 5 things that happen. One of them is that you may emerge with a greater sense of self, which is we've made it through COVID, we've managed to keep our kids in school, we've managed to keep our sanity, we have kept our jobs. Hopefully, you mentioned the loss of jobs. Some of us have not. But in some cases, they realized that they could find other jobs, that they could move on from partners that were not that good. So the sense of also thinking of trauma as a source of strength, I think he described. Also thinking of trauma as a source of greater empathy, which is when we undergo trauma or we help others to, vicarious trauma, I think is his term. You realize that we are all a step away from being in real trouble sometimes. And so I think certainly it's helped me think about being less judgmental about people who may be in difficult situations. The sense that people who come out of trauma become more helpful to each other. So for example, you know, Susanna and I met through LinkedIn. She's always there, has a million things to do, but is very connected, very helpful, and really wants to share. And she emerges from trauma as a better person. So the thought around this topic was, you know, COVID gives us a chance individually to reflect on, how do we become more empathetic? How do we become prouder that we've made it through? But also, how do we help each other and not go back to sort of business as usual?
And I'd like a quick comment to Mohammed. I think that it's important to give ourselves some slack with this, because this is something that happens often to very intelligent people like the crowd here, is that we are in our cognitive brain. And we like to think and we like to figure things out. We have a problem, let's figure out how to do it and create a plan from A to B. That's not the way trauma works, because trauma is really in the unconscious part of us. And we really need to be kind to ourselves. Even if we recognize where the trauma comes from or that we have accumulated trauma, it's really hard to deal with it only with your cognitive brain and understanding. And there are 3 ways to really deal with this. So I advocate really like giving yourself slack, taking a step back and being with it. And then there are 3 ways to change the brain. I mean, Mohammed, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what you do in trauma therapy. You have the top-down approach, which is the cognitive one. You understand, you can do the body scans, you could do sensory experiencing, you can do, yoga, qigong, certain types of breathing. It's something that you do consciously. Muscle relaxation. There are tons of techniques. Just in the realm of trauma therapy, there are, I don't know how many gazillion approaches. So one size doesn't fit all. Sorry, I was talking about the bottom up interventions, of course. I mean, those are the ones that come from the body. What I was referring to there was the bottom up approaches. So the body scan, sensory and bodily awareness and things like that. And then you have the top down ones, which is knowledge, cognitive awareness, changing your habits, changing your mind, talk therapy, coaching. This would be most people's go-to option. I'm going to read more. I'm going to do research. I'm going to Google everything there is to know about this. And trauma doesn't really work that way. And then there's a third one, which Bahia knows quite a bit about, is the horizontal one, where you can go actually and do arts and creative things like, drumming and music and dancing. And there are lots of these things that make us feel good. Paintings, for some people it's music, whatever works for you. And the best thing for trauma is to do all 3 of them. That is the most effective one. And just to finish my part and then let Karen take over, my trauma healing started from boxing. So there's a connection with Klitschko. I fell in love with boxing, and that enabled me to tap into the body that, like my defense systems that I had not been able to do. So you never know where it may come from. It doesn't have to be yoga and mindfulness. It can come from really something completely out of the blue.
I will just add to that regarding everything more artful or community art that can be theater, dance. It's also a thing about the fact that most of the events that are kind of traumatic for us, and some of you mentioned loneliness, being alone, having to carry out this burden alone, is also to think about how to find a sense of community when we are so isolated in our lives. And sometimes just dance, doing a theater piece with others, singing, which is actually connecting us with our most human side. And it's true, I mean, I will not lie about that. I got pulled into like the kind of perfectionist culture of, oh, you need the best grade and you need that and you need the other. And just like, what's the point of art? Because we don't have a clear output. but in the same time is so healing, and something that really doing it in community has been, at least for me, very, very powerful. So just to build up on that. Thank you, Susanna. I will leave it for Karin on the next, if you have any comments.
Yeah, and this is designed to be really a conversation. It's not, we don't have fixed sort of presentations. So Mohammed, thank you for sharing, and any insights are fine. The one thing that popped into my mind was, who did well in the pandemic and who did not. So just picking up on Susanna's point. And so the post-traumatic growth researchers say that being open, with the 5 personality traits, what is it, Ocean, the openness, neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and I'm missing the C, connectedness. So the people who have scored sort of highest on openness tend to do best with post-traumatic growth, because they tend to be more willing to consider different events. Things are novel, so trauma is terrible, but it is also something that is different, that causes you to rethink everything. So it taps usually into the curiosity that many people who exhibit more openness, gregariousness, extroversion. Also, when I look around the group, in my team or people around me, if you can have that sort of change this experience and thinking about what is different about it, what is additive to it and not taking away. So COVID it has really been a practice in sort of stripping us bare from what we had, but thinking about what is it that we still have and what is it that we can become. And that's why when I read this article in the New York Times about the sea slug, I was like, oh my gosh, this potentially could be all of us in COVID. I remember at the beginning of COVID, everybody thought that I would lose my mind because I'm quite a party animal and I'm always out and about and like clubs. And I told a friend of mine who's very introverted, and I said, you're going to have a very hard time because introverted are very focused on the self versus the extroverts are very focused on outside stimulation. And intellectually, COVID has been extremely stimulated. So my hope in this phase of the pandemic is that we're able to step back and think about the fact that maybe having had such a shock in our lifetime is really an opportunity for us to think about whom we value, why do we value, who do we want to become. When you see the Great Resignation, I think another 4.4 million Americans have sort of changed jobs. If we can channel this into the good. Susanna mentioned what is happening with young people. I have to say that this is where I'm going to be turning my attention next, because if we cannot find a way to experience some of the same emotions that at least I've experienced in COVID, to think about how I could make the most out of the situation and help others, then I think it's going to be really, really difficult for the next generation. I think at work, this also applies, which is I work for a business school, I write case studies. And so in the work life, I think it's also a point of view that helps teams to think about, possibilities. And when there are reversals of fortune, how do you make the most of it? And how do you think of the tools that will help you? When we wrote the post about the sea slug, I've had the privilege to work on a case study on Vladimir Klitschko, who's a heavyweight boxing champion, whose brother many have now met, who is the very fearless leader of the mayor of Kiev. And actually, I think we should, talking about trauma, I'll take a few minutes at some point this day to reflect on the trauma that not only the Ukrainians are going through, but also Russian citizens and the diaspora for a lot of our colleagues in the East. And he had a terrible loss, nearly lost his eye. Everybody told him, you got to stop boxing, dude, this is the end. And he said, absolutely not. I'm just going to fire everyone. I'm going to start over with a new coach, a new training regimen, and importantly, a new mental health coach. So he realized that what he really needed in order to become sort of the next sort of version of himself and to have a comeback is to take his physical training and his mental training equally seriously. And I think that, as Susanna mentioned, the COVID has brought out a lot of the mental distress that has been they're hiding in plain sight. We just didn't want to see it. Employee engagement numbers have been around 30% for a decade, but suddenly, top managers are like, oh my God, they're so low. So a lot of the problems that we're not discussing have been around since then. And so we found his approach to be quite interesting, and he describes it as FACE. I'll put the information in the chat when we're done. For focus, so what is it that you really want? Agility, to what extent do you want to be flexible about what you want? Coordination, whom do you want? And at what time, and whom will you need to negotiate to get there? And endurance, which is not to give up, when the going gets hard. And when you hear him talk about, and he did stage an amazing comeback, and he might come back from retirement also. But yes, this notion of being realistic about the resources that we need to move away from beyond defeat. So these were really the themes that were on our mind for today, and then we wanted to share with you. And we'd love to hear more. Interesting in the chat. I thought somebody wanted to say. When we go back into the chat on what people shared, they were very much related to the 5 points from the post-traumatic growth. So the idea of, Marie-Christine and Anne have become bolder, more entrepreneurial, willing to do their own thing. And Gozi reported on, her experiencing a great deal of vicarious trauma because the individuals that she's supporting, she's got to absorb their stress and trying to figure that out. Ken shared about, a medical diagnosis that may lead you to think about how you live every day and what every day means. So we're all in some ways already in this journey together. Any reactions, comments, advice?
Karen, hey, nice to see you, and great topic.
Thank you for joining.
I feel like we are the privileged ones, and yet we are all struggling so much. What is happening with all the people who don't have these kinds of resources? And it's frustrating that, we think about physical health, we go for annual checkups. I'm in healthcare. We educate people to go get their colonoscopies, but we don't have a systematic approach to helping people think about the fact that their mental health is equally important to the physical health. And I wonder if there is any movement on a more systematic public health level to build this in, to really make it a toolkit for people to have, and to be able to, go through some checklists, go through these kinds of resources that we're sharing amongst ourselves, to have someone who is a health professional help people address this and take better care of themselves.
So we had an event in the summer with a couple of folks who work with younger people. And one of the topics that we discussed is the fact that at least in the US, there's sex ed in school, but there's no brain ed.
Yeah.
So we're teaching kids now to practice yoga in order to control their anxiety, but it doesn't go upstream to do what Susanna did, what Mohammed did, which is actually educate us about how our brain works, so that we can try to distinguish the mind from the brain, understand how the brain and the body work together. So I think, Shabnam, it's absolutely should be part of just public education, or at least at the college level when kids get ready to graduate. Much as we take civics in order to be a good citizen, we should there should be some intervention to educate people and also to be better advocates for them, because downstream there's just not enough resources. I mean, in the US, there's such shortage of mental health providers, and I see Susanna, agitating to chime in. But today I was just reading an article about, healthcare, folks leaving the healthcare services. So it's just going to get worse. Susanna, you have an.
I mean, ideally mental health professionals shouldn't be needed, or we need a few people like Mohammed who are psychiatrists for people who have a mental illness, because it's a very different thing from not being mentally well. But ultimately that would be the ideal thing. And I think that we have lost connection in so many ways. I know areas of this world, there aren't any mental health professionals, but they don't really need them because people take care of each other. We are pretty isolated at the moment, but I think we can all agree on that one. But we, in the West, we can't just say, let's be more compassionate, more caring. It doesn't, unfortunately, work that simplistically. But I think that there is a real movement at the moment. Because of my background, I've worked a lot with occupational health and safety. And I know that at the international level, at the International Labour Organization level and government levels, there's more focus on that in countries outside of the United States, where this psychosocial health and safety is actually becoming a mandate. Many European countries, Canada, Australia, are really pushing it, and there's a legislation that's really demanding that organizations create systems that are more human and are not to, causing harm for the employees. So that's one thing. And I think that there's a real momentum now, because when you look at the figures, even before the pandemic, 20% of people were mentally not well or had a diagnosable mental condition. Now the numbers, nobody even knows how bad they are. Depending on the source, it's anything between 40 to 80. The American Psychological Association did a research last year. It was staggering, it's shocking, and so we have to do something. And so governments in certain parts of the world and also in the US are doing things, and organizations are realizing that they have to do something. They have to build structures. There has to be a real systematic approach to this. It won't be a cure for all, but unless we do that, it's better than nothing, and we have to start somewhere. So it's like building a cake, we need the foundation first, and then we can put a cherry on top a few years from now, hopefully.
And seeing even our friends as we made it through, these last 2 years, whatever community, it was very awkward to say, to people who didn't want to admit that they were not doing well, to say, let me help you, or what, you need to get some help, or why don't you think about some of these things? So I think the conversation is a very tricky one to navigate. I've looked back and said to friends, I lost my mother during COVID and I was a mess. And I look back now and I say to friends, why didn't you tell me to get help? I was so drowning in it that I didn't even know. I probably could have done with some medication and some therapy, and nobody said anything. And so it was very interesting. My takeaway is observe more closely to everyone in your field of view, but then figure out how to also take action and help them get to a better place. Like, it's not okay to just see it happening like a movie you can't stop. And I think to learn how to do that better is also another step we have to take as individuals and collectively. And I still am learning. I think that's why I'm here. It's like, how do we do that better? Because this is not going to go away. All the trauma we've had is not going to just solve itself overnight. So how do we do that?
So remember we talked about the threat response. When we learn to be less threatened, we can connect better. When we're not all the time.
I wanted to put a plug in here in the conversation just to let you know that we are actually starting a group around the issue of education and mental health at Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. Several of our members are really interested in this topic, and that's a number of our initiatives have been member initiated, right? They've been launched by members who had a core interest. And so if you are interested in joining this discussion, in then connecting with partners in the area locally, advocating for these measures to support mental health in youth, please email us. I just put the email in the chat, and we're going to launch this group in the coming few weeks. So we're very happy to include you in this email once we launch it. Please let us know if you're interested.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Shabnam, on your comment, the foremost powerful word of the English language, let's see if I can count, is how are you doing? But the most powerful sound in the English language is actually to pause and wait until the person answers, because often we ask this as sort of a rhetorical. And I think, back on Susanna's point about we're all very defendant. So the way that I deal with grief or reversals of fortune is that I intellectualize. So, my father passed away a couple of weeks ago, and I can literally feel myself looking at myself, grieving. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. I am treating myself like I treat my cases and say, well, on the one hand, this is good that he died. On the other hand, this is not so good. So I think particularly with intelligent people, what I like about COVID is that it gives you an excuse to engage, because so many of us are hurting. Now it is a conversation that I have with people, which is, so how did you do in the pandemic? I had these difficulties. How was it for you? How are you feeling? And so one thing about this trauma, which is truly collective, it gives you a common emotional language to connect with people. How are your kids doing? Have you read the latest stats on, suicidal ideations or eating disorders in 8-year-old girls? Have you thought of what Instagram is doing to these girls? So in a way, I think it enables us to be, advocates of mental health, sort of by all and for all, and not punt and say it's the school's responsibility, it's the government's responsibility. To Susanna's point, we shouldn't need that many mental health professionals if we were a little bit more human at our own level. And I think this is why, we called our joint endeavor, human sustainability inside out, because we are burning out. And you can also educate people as much as possible, but as long as we're in capitalist systems, that's just want everything, and ourselves, we want everything faster, better, cheaper, smarter, immediate, more stimulation. We all have to slow down a little bit, and it's really hard because we are really driven people.
Yeah,
but we all play a role in these outcomes.
On that point is something that you mentioned, Shabnam, that's how did you do it? And sometimes it just starts by sharing. So it's easy to say, but just the way to go and just speak about it, right? It just seems crazy that so far, yes, it has been something very shameful, depending which country you live. I mean, I am from Morocco, and when you say, actually, I am not feeling well, what? You have food, you have a roof, what the hell do you want, right? And it's just the point of saying, yes, I feel that I've been like weeks feeling not doing anything, and I feel tired, and that's the way that the other can open. And I think sometimes just to take the first step, and we have been talking a lot about vulnerability whatsoever, but just being human. And as Karin pointed out, like inside, being human with ourselves, but also outside by sharing those kind. And something that when I moved to London and then to Boston to study, something that killed me was like, how are you doing? Are you doing? And people, not so bad, not so bad. At some point, I just asked someone, how are you feeling? And the person looked at me like, the what? It's not your business, my feeling. And I was like, okay, but perhaps that's a good question to ask today. Not how are you doing? I don't care that much what do you do in your life. It's just, how do you feel right now? So that's just something that I want to share, like coming back to your previous point.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very insightful. We are so geared to being productive and doing, but less so to being and being okay. I was recently in Asia visiting family in Pakistan, and the contrast was really stark to me. Nobody cared what I was doing. They were happy I was there. There was kinship, there was joy, there was beauty. And it was fascinating because it was not transactional. Nobody asked, like, what are you doing, work-wise, career. And that had been such a big element of here, of, losing my job during COVID. It was such a big thing. And there it wasn't. And it was really interesting. It's a more relational society than transactional, I think. So the contrast was very interesting to me. And I think also because there's not so much the nuclear family, but more extended families. It seemed that people had made it through COVID with less of this hit of being completely isolated. I think their bubbles were bigger bubbles than here. So it was interesting to compare and contrast.
Yeah, super, super interesting. Any point of view from our far, far away guests
when
how things played out?
When we were talking about how are you doing now, how are you feeling, my mind went to an initiative that started. I think I was watching television, what's their name now? The Como family. I think one of their sisters is an MD or something. She started this initiative, and I think it's called How Do You Really Feel? Yeah, because it's like, how are you feeling? I'm good, and then you move on. That it's always good to stop and look the person straight in the eye and say, how do you really feel? And I think that's the name of the initiative. I felt it's really cool for us to slow down in that, how are you doing, and kind of really show, like, bring the empathy that goes with it, or the humanitarian view of it, to show that we really want to know how you're doing. How are you really doing? And then you'll find out that you might get another response other than I'm cool.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of great links in the chat, and I just wanted to call out, since we've spent so much time talking about connection, that we do have an opportunity through HOM to connect folks through our buddy system. So there's Marie Christine put a link in the chat, but for those who might be looking for additional connections, that would be a great way to stay involved with HOM and make some new connections.
Yeah, thank you for all the resources. I just saved the chat because it's going to be awesome for us to look at and volunteer. And Dr. Naimi, we look forward to seeing you then. When would you be on the docket soon?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So awesome. Do I have like a minute to highlight something?
Yeah, in Germany it's 59.
Yeah, you're right. So yeah, a fact of the matter is that most of the things that you were saying were just making a ton of sense, and I was taking notes, from early on. And the issue of preventive neuromedicine, preventive mental health, or predictive mental health is going to target a wider range of audience. So if we just go for the therapeutic perspective, we just go for the treatment, we realize what the diagnosis is, what's going to be the treatment. And most of the cases, the treatment is based on a guess, as physicians make. And then based on another guess, they will be prescribing some other medications, which is not going to suit properly well for that specific patient. But to go for personalized or precision medicine, if we are using the tools and measures and also the diagnostic, technologies in modern neuroscience and modern neuropsychiatry, then it might be easy to go for a better approach. And I mean, we hit the ball out of the park that way, but it is costly, it is time consuming. We know that. So what we should do, we should go for preventive measures through mental health screening. And we've recently came across a chance of publishing a paper. And fortunately, the paper is now with the health policy desk at Mr. Biden's administration. So we are very hopeful and keeping the fingers crossed. And this is going to change the whole perspective, the whole idea of mental health screening or brain health screening. So if you got a chance, if you would take some time, you go through that paper. This is a policy position statement from the World Brain Mapping and Therapeutics, which is based in California, Los Angeles. And I was privileged to be the first author. So I'm taking much of the responsibilities throughout the process. It's been a tough journey for like a year. And we came up with a policy and like a roadmap, how this is going to be implemented to find the cases early on and not to let them move forward with the mental health and to go for the disease treatment, because it is going to be really meaningful when we go for early diagnosis and treatment. And the other very short comment is the IBH, which is I'm sorry, which the Brain Health Index, BHI. IBH is another initiative. BHI that I and my colleagues we came up with, and I'm very open to share with you whenever possible. It's called Brain Health Index, and they are really fundamental issues and measures, including our physical activity, we score it. Our positively, we score it. And also our diet habit, we positively score it. And also our sleeping habit, we score it positively. Addiction, or like a swing toward using or misusing substances or tobacco stuff. At the bottom of the table, we negatively score it. Also, alcohol misuse, we negatively score it. And mismanagement in a stress or inability to control and stress management when it turns into distress most of the cases. So it all provides us a score between 0 and 100. So when the Brain Health Index or Mental Health Index, in another sense, we have another battery for that, is less than 75. This means that we got to do further assessments, either online questionnaires, pen and pencil, questions and answers to make sure about the general mental health status of the case, and then guide the person to go to the focal points wherever in the States or different continents to get tested initially, low cost, very rapid mental health screening tests and brain health screening tests to make sure if we give the treatment whenever needed, right at a time, then we're going to stay away and avoid over-treating, over-diagnosis, over-cost, and overcharging, and over many things. You know what I mean? So this is what I wanted to share with you here. Thank you for that.
And I want to thank everyone today. This was energizing for me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much to Bahia, Karen, and Susanna for your thoughts and this lively discussion. Clearly this group is passionate. There's a lot of upcoming events that we'd love to have people come to, and should be a poll that you all received. So if you can take a moment and fill that out so we know the right types of events to plan for the future, that would be great. But thank you again. This was terrific.